Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Seldin. I'm president of the Montessori Foundation, and this is the weekly broadcast from the Montessori Foundation's Montessori Leadership Institute webcasts for Montessori educators and especially for Montessori school leaders. With me are my colleagues, Dr. Michael Dorr and Kathy Leach. Both are senior consultants with the Montessori Foundation, and they each have incredibly rich backgrounds of the things that they've done as teacher educators, as speakers and authors and school consultants, and as people who have been classroom teachers. And in the case of you, Kathy, you're still the head of our sister school in Fort Myers, the Renaissance Montessori School. If you should ever need help in your schools, all of us, including Brynn Rangel, who has just joined the foundation as a new specialized consultant in areas of, shall we say, classroom management, not from a Montessori background, because Brynn would be the first to tell you she's a Montessorian by absorption from being a parent and by being a reader, but she's not yet a Montessori trained educator. But I think she has a lot to offer, and I'll do a proper introduction in a moment. But for those of you who may feel that you need a hand, you'd like some kind of either online professional development offered to your staff or to your parents, we travel, have Gun Will Travel, have Montessori materials and will travel. We also do a lot of things by distance, and that for many schools is a much more affordable thing. I know that Margot would absolutely die if I don't promote the Montessori Foundation's conferences coming up. I'm going to just flip to another screen for a moment. There's another one of my favorite things. I'm going to go, hello.
Sorry, something went wrong.
Yeah, it happens.
That happens.
Here we go. mfconferences.org. This is the 21st Annual International Montessori Foundation Conference. And that's mfconferences.org. There is still space and there is still time. I understand there are still good flights going into Sarasota. If it were me, I'd probably fly into Tampa. I would probably rent a car, and then I could travel around in addition to going to our great conference. People often come in a day or two early. They sunbathe on the best beaches in North America. They visit the Newgate School. We welcome you at both the high school and at the rest of the school. They have a marvelous time at all the things that there are to see in beautiful Sarasota. So Margot did want me to share that with you and encourages, if you haven't already made your reservations, just go to mfconferences.org and you can do it right online, pick your workshops, see everything that Kathy is doing, Michael is doing, and Bryn, you're even doing a presentation.
Yes.
So you'll be talking a little bit more about the topic that you're introducing today.
Exactly.
Tim, just to interrupt for a second, we have there's a hotel link there as well. There's a great price on the hotel, and it's a wonderful hotel, and they do fill up fast. So I just want to get the word out that make sure you make your hotel reservations at the same time as well.
That's right. I'm just looking for the picture of the hotel. Got lots of stuff here. If you haven't been to this site, I encourage you to. That's the view, by the way, of the Sarasota Harbor. So it's a kind of fun place. We like Sarasota a lot. And despite the way the national news made it sound, Sarasota fortunately came through with nothing more than a little road flooding and some downed trees and power outages for a day or two in some neighborhoods. We were fortunate. Next week, by the way, our special guest will be Michael Bourne, the headmaster of the Virgin Islands Montessori School. And they reopened after 2 full-scale Class 4 or Category 5 hurricanes. They just reopened on Monday. That wasn't just luck. That was the result of careful planning and really good leadership from Michael Bourne and his team. And I've been in touch with them before, during, and after the storms. And I think Michael, the other Michael, Michael Bourne, not just Michael Doerr, who always has lots of good stuff to offer. Michael, I think, will be of use to all of us, regardless of where your school is located. Because if it's not a hurricane, it could be a tornado or a fire or an earthquake or who knows what. He's basically talking about how do you keep your community together when you've taken it right on the chin, and how do you prepare, how do you respond, what do you do? So this week we've got Brynn Rangel, and Brynn, let me tell them a little bit about who you are. Brynn Rangel is an organizational analyst and a behavioral analyst, and she'll explain that better. But one way of understanding it quickly from our perspective as Montessori educators is this is a very different set of skills. John Wolfe often talks about the kinds of things that Bryn does. It's basically looking at the lines of communication in an organization, the way we as school leaders use our time, the way people's needs are met, the way communication flows, trying to figure out what creates highly functional organizations. And if you're a member of an organization that feels like it's getting bogged down, how to get unbogged down. And I can speak from personal experience. She's got a lot to offer. She also trained as a behavior analyst. And today our topic is not the big dog, which is what's on your screen, I think, right now, which is one of my favorite websites, Dimensions of Observable Growth, or DOG, which, by the way, is the name of one of my puppies you all have met before. But rather a resource that Bryn and Michael and Kathy and I will chat with you about in the context of our purpose today, which is what do you do as a Montessori educator when you run into behavior that isn't responding to the normal tricks that you use, the more extreme or persistent inappropriate behaviors that sometimes can happen. I want to remind you that some of us really wish kids came without parents. Some of us really talk a lot about, oh, Bryn is such a perfect Montessori child, otherwise known as she came into our school behaving the way we wanted in the first place, forgetting that Montessori teaches us how to work with a really wide range of children. We have the ability to meet the needs of a really big group. That doesn't mean our teachers or we as leaders necessarily remember all the things that can speed up the process. That's why we're here with you, Bryn. Bryn, let me turn it over to you, and this will be more like a conversation. I want to remind all of you that you can ask questions or make comments at any time, and I know Bryn is anxious to have it become a discussion. While I can't open your mic, you can go to the little question panel and write to us, and Kathy and I will jump in and feed out your questions as we go along. So Bryn, welcome. We're so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to be here. I wanted to touch base, like Tim said, about those children that come into the Montessori classroom and are either struggling to normalize or maybe have something going on with their development that creates these outlier problematic behaviors. Now that can be anything from things along the lines of executive functioning all the way to some sort of emotional dysregulation. Maybe we're seeing some sort of tantrums or throwing things or something, but maybe not even to that extreme. So I wanted to come in and say that while my job on a daily basis is to look at problematic behaviors, the focus is not on reducing the problem. While we want to make sure that we're not accidentally reinforcing those types of behaviors and we aren't triggering them, we want to focus on what skill sets we are teaching the kids. What replacement skills are we teaching? And to do that, we want to make sure that we're developing the idea that we want students to become increasingly self-aware so that we can focus on the social and emotional learning that needs to take place in order to help these children reduce the problematic behaviors. So before I begin with any type of specifics, I wanted to open it up and ask the community, what type of challenges are you seeing in your classrooms? What types of behaviors are you seeing that you find difficult or that end up competing with the flow of the classroom or the peace in the community or anything like that? Do you have any specifics that you can come up with?
Hopefully they do, and as they do, I'll tell you two quick stories about my grandchildren. The first is his dad and mom were in a parent-teacher conference at his school, and Dad, Mark, raised his hand and said to the teacher, "What do you do when your child's a space cadet?" And the teacher, without blinking an eye, said, "You must be Jackson's father." The second is there are two boys. One is a year or so older than the other, and the younger one was at soccer practice, and he just had to go to the bathroom, even though it was time to go out on the field and practice, and Dad's the coach. So Dad's out there working with a bunch of 5-year-olds and trying to get them in order, and little guy, says, "I don't want to go to the outdoor porta potty." Well, the long and the short of it is he went in there, he locked himself in there, he screamed, made a huge scene. Dad finally had to go off the court, leave these 5-year-olds out there, try to get in. Of course, it's locked, and basically there's a spider in there, and he's just screaming and yelling. And I suspect all of you have had things like that happen, and if not, welcome to my world. I see that Jody said something. Says, "I wonder if it's on your end or my end, but your screen keeps freezing and sound keeps being cut off." How's it look on your end, guys?
Looks good to
We're
me.
okay. Generally, that's a slow internet connection. If she's seeing that happen, the freezing up, it generally is on her end. So if you close other browser windows that you have open, that sometimes will help. And Tim, we have a couple other ideas here for Bryn from Kay and Cybele. Extreme lack of attention, ADD. Children having hard time initiating work and staying on task from Cybele. And let's see, Heather says we have a student who came from a different type of school and is really struggling with hitting, grabbing, punching, rather than using words to engage. Now, it's important to know he's 4. And Jody has a 5-year-old, I think that boy, who has very little self-control. His first response to any frustration or issue is to hit and scream. He frequently hits other children as well as staff. He's also very often in video game mode, that's his words, and reenacts video games in our classroom rather than engaging in work. So those are all, there's a whole bunch more. This is a hot topic. This is, just to give you an idea, resistance to any change of activity, child refuses to do any kind of work, just as simple as changing shoes. We have non-compliance, just general, not listening, not complying with school routines and things. Anne says she's at a Title I school. She deals with aggression and disrespect towards other students and authority figures, along with deep-rooted academic problems. Oh my gosh, there are so many more. I've never seen responses come in as fast as this. So Bryn, you have your work cut out for you. I don't know.
I'm excited.
I know we can't do each individual.
Sure.
Go ahead, Tim.
A good way to start is, as a Montessori mom who also is trained in behavior analysis, which is a profession I'm not sure that most of us know much about. We're used to counseling and psychotherapy and special educators. What is it that you feel that we as Montessori educators are best at, and where do you think that we need a hand that you could give us?
Well, I think that Montessori educators are best at looking at the whole child. And my experience as a mom has been that the amount of care and the amount of attention to detail and the amount of desire for my son's well-being has been unlike any other setting I've ever experienced. And I give so much credit to everyone that poured into him, because he would not be who he is today. And my son was a child who came into the Montessori setting with deficits and with some problematic behaviors. So I can appreciate the hard work that everybody already does. So thank you, thank you, thank you for that. And one of the things I think the Montessori setting does well, that in the world of behavior analysis we call pairing, is just the rapport that education systems work for each child, because it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. And especially when you have kids coming from any type of trauma background, that could be anything, right? That could be worst case scenarios, that could be different types of home life settings where things have been disrupted for that student. So maybe that traditional positive statement towards that child, maybe that's not received the same way. And Montessori seems to take the time to get to know each child and be able to speak to them the way that they need to hear it. So on the flip side of maybe some of the things that we can do better, I wish we had days and days to talk about this, and I hope this conversation continues for a long time, and I would love to help in any way that I can, is to talk generally speaking. So all of the behaviors that you just mentioned, we see them all the time. You are not alone. And I want you to understand that it is not you. And I'm talking to the teachers, if you're feeling any sort of frustration, that this is happening all over the place. So anything from struggling with transitions to non-compliance, inability to focus, any types of aggression. I even heard some things that I would consider to be self-stimulatory behaviors. Maybe there's some scripting going on.
Can you just used a couple of phrases. Montessori is always accused of using special Montessori language, jargon.
Right.
You said the word, was it phrasing? No. Self-stimulation.
Scripting.
The word scripting.
Scripting.
What's scripting?
Scripting.
Yes. And we see that pretty well focused in a lot of our kids, maybe on the autism spectrum disorders, where a child will recite words, phrases, scenarios from television shows, games, things that they've read, and there's usually some sort of repetition to it. But the unfortunate part is that it will take place in such a way that it'll disrupt other types of communication and language. So teaching the child functional language when maybe their preference, and it is very reinforcing to self to engage in those other types of behaviors, can be a little bit tricky. But it can be done with frequent enough feedback to the child. And by feedback, I mean noticing what they're doing well, providing opportunities for functional communication, and giving that child the feedback about how that went. So back to talking about some of the more problematic behaviors, my experience so far with Montessori has been that the teachers are well versed in doing observations. So something's not going quite right. So they come in and they look at their student or students, and they take this anecdotal record or data collection of what they're seeing. They're observing it. From the ones that I've seen, I find them to be very strong in describing the behavior. So I would call that the topography, what the behavior looks like. And they're very strong in describing the consequence, what occurs after the behavior, what was the result, what happened to the student next to them, how did that particular student react. In behavior analysis, one of the biggest tools that I use is called ABC data collection. So that's antecedent, behavior, consequence data collection. But to simplify it, the antecedent portion is to observe the setting to observe the trigger. It's being that detective of what just happened. We see the behavior, the child's having a tantrum. We see that after the tantrum or during the tantrum, the other students are upset. That child is upset. That child either regulates or fails to regulate. But what happened before? Because what happens before is going to dictate what we do about it afterwards, in determining that function of why did that happen and how can we address it best. Because if the student is hyper aware of the environment and the air conditioning clicked on, that might be why they're tantruming. Making assumptions about what occurred, if there was some sort of offense or some other type of discomfort, we could be missing the point entirely. I was recently meeting with a teacher who had a student that was getting in the faces of the other students and clapping their hands, snapping their fingers, making rude comments. And because that was upsetting to the students, understandably so, the teacher was directing them to say to him, stop, please stop. When you do this, it makes me feel X, Y, and Z, which is beautiful communication. But what they failed to understand was that from an outside perspective, those problematic behaviors were only occurring during times of minimal attention. It was attention seeking. So even by providing that child with feedback immediately of please stop, they were reinforcing that behavior. The child was actually getting what they were hoping for. So we came in and started teaching the students how to self-advocate. When this is occurring under these circumstances, how do I remove myself from the situation and then revisit it in conversation at a time when it wouldn't be so reinforcing to the student, and start interrupting and breaking some of those change. I just want to make sure if we have any questions so far. I know I'm talking a lot.
Hang on a second. I want to make sure that we've got some of the words. The first phrase was scripting. So if I heard you correctly, scripting in your profession is something that you might see from a child who is essentially playing out a scenario, maybe that he's seen in a cartoon or something like that, or some fantasy of maybe superheroes or whatever, and you're seeing it play out, and it's disruptive. So it's not what Eric Byrne called life scripting or a game, although it is a game. It's more fantasy play. And used another phrase. Do you all remember what that second one was? Scripting and
self-stimulatory?
Self-stimulate. So self-stimulating, I'm assuming, is they need to be babbling or talking or interacting with people, and so they go out, and if no one approaches them, they'll make it happen.
Right, correct. And of course that, when I talk about self-stimulatory behaviors, I'm talking about behaviors that are maintained by self-stimulation. So the child would do it in what I would call the alone condition. Even if nobody else was around and they were sitting in a room by themselves, they would do this and this would feel good to them. And that is why they do it. When I talk about functions of behavior, there's reasons why behaviors occur. One is to escape or avoid a situation. 2 is to gain attention. 3 is to access preferred tangibles or activities. And 4 would be that automatic sensory stimulation. So to talk about something more extreme, maybe a child inflicts pain to themselves in some capacity. It might be for escape. It might be for self-stimulation. These are the things that why we want to look at those setting events, those antecedent conditions that are not only occurring just before the behavior occurs, and that's where those observations are so important, but also what is going on at home. When we talk about setting events, right? Is the child sick? Has there been a change in medications? Is there a change in home life? When they showed up at school today, were they themselves? Were they not themselves? What happened on the car ride? And then that immediate of what happened right before. And so this is, like I said, where we want to become those really good detectives and figuring out why certain behaviors are happening so that we can address them properly.
Excellent. So once again, in terms of what you sense that Montessorians could learn that would improve their abilities to be highly effective with a wide range of children. I'm assuming essentially that you believe that the work that you do in behavioral analysis could be grafted into the bag of tricks that Montessori educators use. And of course, some already have this, either because they took similar training or they figured out strategies somewhere along the line that achieve similar results. So I notice a lot of Montessori educators will do things like creating ground rules, trying to get the group to be peer reinforcers. They attempt to have the classroom have a routine, but a routine that is structured but allows for children to largely self-select activity. They have broad limits. And so where it becomes problematic is typically at transition times, when the children are moving from, let's say, individual work to putting their work away and needing to go to a phys ed class or music class or get ready for the end of the day. You may see acting out behavior. Or it could be when the child is just in a rotten mood. You get some kids that come in the morning and you sense they got a cloud hanging over them. And I've seen teachers not know what to do with that. Or they're off at the specialist activity and they're giving the Montessori art teacher a hard time. I mean, it seems like our specialists always catch a much more difficult time than our classroom teachers typically do. And then there's the extreme behaviors, the kid who comes in like some of the ones that our audience has been describing, who are adversarial or challenging in one way or the other. And again, I think, if I've heard you correctly, Bryn, what you're saying is we want to look at two things. One, we want to really look at what's happening, which is sort of self-obvious. We talk about observation all the time. So I'm assuming you have a sense we can do better at our ongoing observing of the reality of what's happening. And secondly, we want to be sure that we're not reinforcing the inappropriate behavior unintentionally.
Right. And thus, you need to determine the function of the behavior so that you can make sure that you're not accidentally providing the wrong kind of feedback to the student, because it can be of the best of intentions, but it may in fact be reinforcing if you're not looking at that portion of things.
I'm seeing Tanya Riskin just shake your head. Sounds to me like you've seen this before, Tanya.
Well, part of my background was originally as a social worker and clinical social worker that did a lot of work with children in residential treatments. And when we went into the schools and looked at the teachers' behaviors, albeit non-Montessori, but Bryn brings up a really important key component of who we are and our own preparation is well-intentioned people can do harm or can make or exacerbate the situation, because it's not about our kindness or our intentionality. It's about who is this child in front of us and what do they need.
Very good point. One of the things we're hearing from lots of schools, Montessori and otherwise, is the rising percentage of kids that are showing up who are either seem to have something along the line of ADHD, hyper distracted to an extreme, or we're hearing a lot of talk about the spectrum, these really quirky kinds of kids. What are your thoughts, folks?
Well, Tim, we have a question here for Bryn. A couple of people have asked again to repeat the language of the ABC behavior, the antecedent. So if you could go ahead and at least describe those ABCs again so people understand what you're referring to.
No problem at all. So ABC, data collection, it stands for A for antecedent, B for behavior, and C for consequence. And just to put it in layman's terms, antecedent has to do with setting, triggers, situations. So what happened before, directly before the behavior occurred. And then when recording the behavior, make sure to focus on the topography. What exactly did it look like? Because when you say that Johnny hit Paul, did he do it with an open hand? Was it a closed fist? Because when we want to start talking about severity and intensity, it's a very different conversation. So we want to get as specific as possible because we want to give our kids a fair shot. Sometimes things feel much more offensive than maybe in fact they actually are, but we don't know that unless we have the data behind it to have that conversation with our administrators and our parents. And so making generalized statements can kind of lead to other types of assumptions that can be dangerous. So I just want to make that point. And then consequence is what happens directly after the behavior. What resulted? What does it look like for the student of question, the people around him and her, or potentially the environment, right? Because property destruction is a very real thing.
So one of the things you're talking about is data. And you've mentioned that quite often we as educators get an idea in our heads about what's going on, and we're not necessarily remembering accurately. We either paint the situation with rose-colored glasses. You know, we have this, you know, how wonderful everything is. I've got such a great group of kids. Forgetting that, you know, Johnny is beating up on little Sally, and Sally is going home and telling her mommy that, you know, she's afraid to come to school every day because little Johnny is beating up on her.
Right.
So you could have rose-colored glasses, or you could get it in your head that Michael is really a challenging boy, and you know he's just not right for Montessori. Right. So when you talk about data, what do you mean? Because Montessorians, I don't know, somehow collecting data on this kind of stuff doesn't sound like what we learn in our training.
Okay, for sure. And data collection is my life, so I'm happy to share it with you. Okay, so there...
We learn a lot about observation. I have a question here from Mary. We learn a lot about observation and recording data, but not so much about strategies of what to do once we have recorded the data. And even which data is essential to record, because you're giving, you know, some really good structure to what to, you know, what to record. But
sure.
Mary O'Young, I think she sums up a lot of what we're hearing in some of these questions here. The fact is most teachers are ill-trained or equipped to handle these challenges. So we can be instructed on what to do and what to look for, but the strategies take more training. How can we meet the needs of the children while still trying to teach them? So we're doing behavioral guidance, we're data recording, and you know, we're responsible for educating these children. So she says it seems insurmountable, as each year we seem to have children with more and more issues. I'm not complaining, but we need a solution. And I think that really sums up a lot of how people feel right now.
I understand completely. So I have a lot of things to say on that, so please interrupt me if you feel like we need to stop or ask more questions. I'm going to go through what I would consider to be a process when I hear those types of statements and I'm coming into a teacher who is just like, help me, just help. This is where we start. We start with those more or less laborious observations. Now, if it's me, I come in and I do them for the teacher because I understand that they need to teach. But it is something that they can do, or have a support staff do, or have an administrator do, in terms of just identifying what is going on. Because when you're trying to keep track of a large group, yes, it's very hard to focus in on one particular student. So we want to do that, but we want to do it for as short amount of time as possible. Typically, I will go and observe a particular student 3 times for approximately an hour. It gives me a good shot of just what's going on. The next thing that I do with teachers from there is say, okay, what are the priorities? Because we can't focus on them all at once. What are the biggest problems? And what are the most important skill sets to teach that are going to combat those problems? So I never pick more than 1 to 3 problematic behaviors to focus on at a time. And then same thing on the increasing side, maybe no more than 3, because we don't want to overload our teachers. They have plenty to do. But at the same time, we have to individualize to help these kids. Once we determine, okay, Johnny is engaging in physical aggression, so that will be our decreasing target. Well, we need to increase his communication. Maybe it's asking for help. Maybe it's self-regulation in terms of directing himself to go take breaks. Whatever the increasing skill sets are, we then put a plan in place with the teacher to do that. And that's going to look different under different circumstances. And you're right, it does take additional training. I put together a data collection form for my teachers. It's called Total Progress System. There's lots of ways to do this, so I don't want you to get caught up on the names of what I do. I'm happy to share it, but that's just what I use. And basically all it is just a line in an Excel spreadsheet that defines the different targets, so what's decreasing and what's increasing. And all the teacher has to do is at the end of each, I'm going to call them an academic period, so maybe after the work period, after lunch, after whatever. So it's partial interval recording. At the end of each period of time, determined again by the teacher, what makes their lives easier? Is that every hour? Is it every 2 hours? What is it? What are the natural breaks where they can stop for a second and say, did that happen or did it not happen? And all they write down is 0, 1, 2, or 3. It either occurred or it didn't occur, and then what intensity. And we have defined that ahead of time. So 3 would be the greatest intensity, and 0 would be it didn't occur at all. And like I said, all of this we define in advance, so it's as easy as possible. So they're just writing down a series of numbers, maybe 7, 8 numbers a day, and that's it. But what that then does after that data collection, we run that for about 2 to 4 weeks, because that gives us the snapshot of when are these behaviors occurring, what are the times of day, and exactly how intense are they. So how much do we need to actually focus on this? Being able to have that very real, very honest conversation is going to help across the board, because maybe it is that during a certain amount of time that teacher needs to reduce their ratio. Maybe they need another support staff member in there. Maybe that's when administration needs to come in. Maybe that's when the specials teacher requires some extra help. Whatever the case may be, but we can't have those specific conversations about how can we best support our staff unless we know when these things are occurring and exactly how intense they are. And intense can be good or bad, so I don't want to have that negative connotation, so to speak. So once we're able to say, okay, these things are happening, this is when they're happening, and this is what it looks like, then we can start talking about what can you handle. So what will be the teacher's responsibility in their behavior, and what do we actually have to do differently? Because kids are going to respond potentially to whole group contingencies, small group contingencies, and then other things are going to be one-on-one. And those kids that aren't even responding to those one-on-one interventions, potentially we have to add additional interventions that usually look like gross motor activities. They just can't sit anymore and they have to move. So I go through different things of, okay, this is something we can address through the whole group, you know, what the teacher's already doing with the entire class. Okay, this is something we're going to have to address with the student more in a smaller group setting. Can we use our peers? Is there an additional staff member that can step in and help with this or create these types of situations to practice these skills? Is this something that we have to actually work with the student with one-on-one? And then, you know, like we've also talked about, a lot of our ADHD kiddos, a lot of our kiddos on the spectrum, yes, we want to work to increase their endurance over time, but there are times when their little bodies simply have to move. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
A couple of things. One is, also often I hear teachers say in all kinds of schools, I'm not trained to do this. And they get really scared when they hear things like, this child has an IEP, or this child is on some medication or has a diagnosis, or this child is just weird. Right. And I want to really encourage us to remember what our heritage is. Montessori was dealing with some truly weird kids, really, really challenging backgrounds. And over 110 years, let's face it, we get people coming into Montessori schools for all kinds of reasons. At 2 or 3, it may just be the parents need child care, or the parents have read a lot about it and they're well educated and they've heard Montessori is the gold standard. But quite often, by age 6, the ones who are still with us, if we're in a tuition paying school, will usually become increasingly children who are either extraordinarily gifted and really would be bored silly in most schools, or kids that in some way or the other would not do well in other schools, either because they can't stand to sit still at a desk, they're way too intellectually challenging, they ask too many questions and aren't complacent, compliant, or the parents just have an intuition that this child would be eaten alive at a traditional school.
And a lot of times those two things go together.
Yeah, yeah. And these kids are often, they are the kids we get quite often. And they are the kids that we seem to really do well with, but we still have this fantasy of the ideal Montessori child. And there really is no ideal Montessori child. They're all a pain in the neck at times. And the other thing is, I love what I think was Muriel said. The more our teachers know what to do as their skill set grows in terms of really practical, what do I do when, which includes a couple of things. One, not being scared. You know, kids these days just do weird things. I mean, who knows? They may have an eating disorder. They may talk about harming themselves. They may, I don't know. It's certainly, we've gone through iterations of them talking about superheroes of one sort or the other. All this kind of stuff happens, and it is just part of the deal. It's part of dealing with kids, and it helps, I think, for us to, as much as we can, learn to thing I wanted to say is it really helps if the teacher feels that she's got an administration that's got her back, and that the other parents of the classroom, or shall we say the whole community of the school, has a mindset that we're all in it together and none of our kids are perfect. I had a dad calling me just today saying, you know, my kid just needs an environment where nobody ever has any problems. And there's this other kid who's talking about how she's feeling anxious and depressed. And this father's really upset. Well, okay, I respect that. But Donna Gertz, who wrote Children Who Are Not Yet Peaceful, talks in her book about one of the strategies is not just what do we teach the teachers, but how do we help the children of the class and the families of the class to not see this as one case. You know, we've got this weird kid, you know, out here, and because of this one weird kid, we've all got to be really patient with this one kid. It's more an ethos within our school of we have each other's backs. We're in it together as a community, and at any given day, anyone, including you, me, and our brother, could be a pain in the neck. And this is how we teach our kids to work together to keep the peace together. Does that resonate with any of my colleagues? Mm-hmm. Hi, Michael, you're back.
I'm back for a while. Thank you. I'm sorry, Bryn, that I stepped out for a moment.
That's okay. No problem.
We do have a lot of comments coming in, and I think that, you know, we've all helped, coached, mentored teachers who are really struggling and, you know, just are at a loss. And I think that certainly we can look at, you know, just from the standpoint of teacher training, helping with some of this. And I think some of that has improved over the years where some of this is being integrated into our training programs. But there's no way without the experience and you know, even some, you know, helping us get a different perspective on how we look at things. And Bryn, one of the things you said early on was that we as Montessorians were really good at, you know, building relationships and seeing the child in a holistic way and being positive with them. But what we don't have is that and most of us here on the panel have been in Montessori for 40 plus years. And so we've been dealing with children for a long time, and we've seen a difference. We've seen a difference in the number of children who are having difficulty in the classroom. And so what we're asking of our teachers is, I think, to put on so many hats. We came into this being educators, and now we're expected to be therapists and behavior analysts and family counselors and all of these things. And I understand Tim's comment. I have the same situation from parents who sort of expect that their child, because Montessori is a personalized method of education, that their child will get exactly only what they need. And that the other, it's like there are those little silos in the classroom. And so, I don't want my child affected by everybody else. Well, they're part of a community. Or, my child learned it from them, and so we're going to blame everybody. And so there's just, it's a difficult thing, I think, for parents and for teachers. I don't think that there's a simple answer. I like that you were giving us some sort of a step-by-step on the observing and prioritizing and pretty much, what kind of support are you going to need to deal with these behaviors? What can any particular teacher handle? I think that was a wonderful way to say it. What I find is that the teachers, we can only expect the teachers to do what's in their capacity today. They are where they are today. And so we may want to coach and mentor to get somewhere else in the long run, but we have to be realistic about what the skills and the tolerance that our teachers have.
And this is really basic daily maintenance. In other words, we talked about the importance of teacher education. And this is becoming so exceptionally important that for more than 20 years, I've had Montessori educators question whether you can still normalize a class in the modern world, or whether digital devices don't screw everything up. There's lots of thoughts and perspectives, but I would suggest that, again, what Bryn is talking about is something similar to what you, Kathy, and you, Tanya, and Andrew Cutt, and Kath Coles, and Lorna McGrath, and Jane Nelson, all of the folks that are teaching Adlerian psychology as it applies to building relationships, creating a cooperative classroom, and redirecting children's behavior. So that's a really, really important skill set that every teacher ought to have. I would suggest that from what I know of you, Bryn, you're working in that domain and you're going beyond. You're talking about what do you do when all that nice Adlerian and Rogerian iMessaging and ground rules and redirecting doesn't work. Right. When things get really disruptive, what are your choices other than kicking a kid out of the school?
Right.
How do you short circuit this? And the key thing I've heard you say thus far, in addition to Kathy's truism, which teachers can only do what they're ready and able to do right now. They can't eat more than they can chew. Is to, one, organize pretty systematic training resources to help those teachers who are hungry and are ready, willing, and able to learn. That's one thing. And then secondly, a key concept of what you're teaching is you can't do it all at once. You've got to prioritize and figure out where do you begin, because quite often you got 30 kids in the class, you got 30 different kids and who knows how many issues. But for any classroom, there's typically going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 really critical behaviors happening from one or more children that you really want to zero in on and try to reduce it.
Right, and that can set the tone for the entire class. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen it 100 times where one student is really running the room at certain points in time. So prioritizing those goals, like I said, identifying them and then prioritizing of these are the 1, 2, or 3 things in the whole class with our kids or with one particular student, whatever the case may be, that we're going to focus in on. You have to break it into smaller parts. It is overwhelming. And we are oftentimes only one or two people as adults in the classroom. Cultures are shifting, all sorts of things are going on. Kids are not learning many, many skill sets at home that they used to learn. So we have these kids for a finite amount of time. A lot of times it's what, a third, a fourth of all the hours of the day. And the thing that we can do the most, and there's systems for this, is providing as many touch points of verbal feedback as humanly possible, all addressing what we expect and how they're meeting those expectations, how they're participating in the community in ways that are active and positive. I use a program that we call ICU. And yes, it's in a different school setting. And in that school setting, there's a lot of technology being used. But again, this doesn't have to be on, an active board or on a computer screen. It is about helping the teacher become more self-aware and also helping the students gain enough feedback to actually combat the fact that they're not going to receive this feedback anywhere else except during the daytime. And basically, it's just each child's name. And when you touch the child's name, a tally mark appears. And it's letting the students know that they're receiving feedback for whatever the group or the class decided they were going to focus on. Maybe it's being nice to others, and that's specifically defined. What does being nice to others mean? But the teacher is then keeping track of how many times they're speaking to their students about these goals. And it also gives the kids a tangible, something they can see of not only I received that feedback, but in fact, at the end of the day, this is where I'm at, this is where I'm going. It helps them create their own goals, because by saying to the children enough times, I see you doing X, that's going to help them then take on that language so they have it for themselves and they can start to say, I see myself doing these types of things. We then want to move the students into self-reflection. This is something they should be able to do, that they could be stopped at any point in time, and you ask them, those goals that we're working on, how are you doing with that? And that creates a different conversation once they're able to have it and have the language to do it of, well, I think I'm meeting those goals, or maybe, today was a different day because, and the teacher can give that feedback of, you know what, I agree with you, or you know what, let's take a look at that, because I feel like you see yourself doing these things, but this is in fact what I'm seeing, and it helps with those types of discrepancies. So like I said, the ICU program that I use, not only is it data tracking and does it create, an actual product that we can all look at and keep track of things over time, but it helps the teachers become more aware of how often are we actually having this conversation? Are my students receiving enough feedback? Because one student might be able to hear something from their teacher once every 15 minutes and that be adequate to gain that skill. You're going to have other students that are going to need a smile. They're going to need a thumbs up. They're going to need some type of feedback at a much, much higher frequency. I'm not saying that's possible for every student, and that is where those other conversations come in about ratios and about doing the proper record reviews, asking the right questions during the admissions process to try to set our teachers up for success, because we can't expect them to do it with every single student, but we can help them do it with the few who maybe require a little bit more need.
So clarify what you were just saying. At the admissions process, there are things that schools could do that would give their teachers a better chance of success. I'm not sure if anyone else senses a need to have that be explored further. What do you think, Kath, Michael, Tanya?
Yes, I'd like to hear more on that.
Yeah, and I think we have a lot of school leaders on here who are working hard to support teachers, and so I think, if there's things we can be doing proactively on the front end, I think that's a really important piece.
I bet you at least one administrator has probably just put down parents lie, or parents just don't bother to tell you. So again, how do you
it does happen.
And that's the important part, is what are the questions that they can ask in the beginning that will elicit an authentic response without putting parents in the position of either denial or defensive. Because all parents want what's best for their children, and sometimes they want to put their child somewhere where they want their child safe and accepted for who they are, and that's what we sell. We sell that your child will be safe and accepted for who they are, when in some cases our schools aren't prepared to accept every child for who they are.
Well, in that case, Tanya, I think it's a two-way street, isn't it? There are questions we may want to ask, as you just said, but maybe there's statements we need to make as well. So about what it is we're like, what it is that we do here, what are our expectations about whatever. Because I think that while we do the questioning, a lot of families may make presumptions about what we are that may or may not tally with reality too well.
Yeah, this goes back to my whole theory of how do we admit parents, and the fact that many of us go out for one date and next thing you know we're moving in together and buying a house and having kids. Not a good idea, in my opinion, because so many parents really don't want Montessori. They want something very different, and it just leads to a bunch of aggravated people. I noticed that we had someone ask, can we change the screen to see the full slide? Are you all able to see the dimensions of observable growth?
Tim, we see about 2/3 of the screen. There's just the bottom part we're not
see what I can do about that.
Yeah. And Bryn, we're going to let you get back to that whole admissions piece. And after that, I'll tell you I have a lot of questions and comments I want to try to throw out. So if you, once Tim fixes his screen.
I want to take a moment before we do, because Bryn asked me to have this website up, and Bryn's got a lot to offer. And one of the things that I know, Bryn, you would like to do is work with schools that are feeling that they need some real staff development of that, and that's the kind of thing that could be done either by traveling to a school or doing it as we're doing this webcast, one-on-one by consultation. And Bryn, you and I have spoken about the idea of organizing a multi-session course that could be delivered live or recorded for staff development. And I think that plays a role too. And thank you, by the way, the person, Virginia, who asked that we change this so you can see it. So I just want to tell you what Grow Dog Grow is. It's growdoggrow.com. The way I always find it is I Google Dimensions of Observable Growth. And what this is a free service developed by the people from the Great Work Foundation out in Golden, Colorado. You can set up a free site. As far as I know, you can still log in. Here's my login. And once you're in there, the beauty of this is Dimension of Observable Growth is a resource. One of the things I've done is I've created a version of this that I could share with anyone that wanted to. But the really beautiful thing is you create your own. So I'm going to go to dogs, which is like, here's a Children's House Dimension of Observable Growth, or DOG. And hopefully you're seeing on the screen a series of attributes. And for example, alertness. And this is the lowest stage right there. Alertness, often unaware, inattentive, tends to engage in fantasy-based daydreaming frequently. And emergent, which would be the next higher level, sometimes is unaware, inattentive, needs support to bring back to the current reality. And then you can see next to it developed, which is a higher level of behavior. Think of this as a growth chart of normalization. And the beauty is, this is a starting point. You can build your own, you can modify it, you can add to it. it's really self-explanatory if you go in there. And if you're not sure how to use it, Bryn can coach you through it, or really any of us can from the rest of us foundation. It's a fairly clear-cut tool. But in the same way that we have lists of Montessori exercises and we think about, have we just introduced it? Is the child working towards it? Has the child mastered it? This is intended to be a very extensive list, and you make selections from there of goals that you're setting. Now, by the way, this is not what Bryn means when she says pick 1 or 2 or 3 target behaviors. They can be included in this, but these are descriptors of the ideal behavior you're looking for in a child. And I just started with attention. It could just as easily have been about aggression or cooperativeness or honesty, any number of different dimensions of observable social and emotional growth. So I really encourage you to go to that website, explore it yourself. I'm going to copy the URL. I'm going to send it to you all, and you'll check it out on your own time. So there it is back on the screen, and I'm going to send you, I just sent you the link to that particular website. I highly recommend. It's a great contribution from the people at the Great Works Foundation out in Golden, Colorado. Bryn, back to you.
Just to expand on what you were saying, Tim, I like it too in that it starts a conversation in a way that maybe the community is familiar with, going with those already defined attributes and what we're looking for to see, you know, our students grow over time. I like them to take something like this, and I use a formalized tool. That's a social and emotional skill inventory assessment. There's more informal ways to have this conversation as well, because I use a rating system. But I like to take it then and break it into smaller parts in terms of defining what behaviors we're looking for in the areas of problem solving, self-awareness, social awareness, executive skills, emotional competence, and conceptual and language foundations. This is where we can set individualized goals for each student, or we can do it as a whole class. It is fun to take these dimensions and these attributes and have that conversation with our students and say, what does this look like to you guys? You know, how can we do this together and make it into a lesson and something that is revisited, you know, over an extended period of time, so that the kids really start to understand, you know, what we're looking for and how that's defined, and we can start to position them to give each other feedback as well. So that's where I think the Dimensions of Observable Growth, it's a really neat tool in terms of, okay, this is what we're looking for and this is where we're going. The conversation that I help people have is, how do we break it into small, manageable parts, and how do we get everyone able to participate in that process, for sure. And then how do we help the teacher support the students by providing the appropriate feedback at a high enough frequency. I didn't know, Kathy, if you wanted to get back to that admissions question, or if you wanted to talk a little bit more, everyone, about this.
I think we need to spend a little bit of time on the admissions question, just to give you an idea. We have about 25 minutes or so left. We do have quite a few questions and comments. I'll be happy to kind of go through those a little bit, maybe in bulk, because I don't think you'll be able to do each individual one, but some of them will inform the next part of the conversation. So I'm sure we'd love to hear what you have to say about anything we can do proactively from the beginning.
Sure. So the admissions process is something that, you know, again, I would love to help with and have helped many schools with formalizing and bringing some things into light that maybe we don't ordinarily think about, because a process that worked 10 years ago potentially doesn't work right now. There's been these massive shifts in terms of, you know, home life and culture, and, you know, what kind of kiddos we're seeing, and just different things across the board. So we have to be able to have some different conversations. Our parents, of course, have to be a part of the process from start to finish, and we value their input. it is not the beginning and the end of the conversation. I would challenge our administrators to really take a look at the level of conversation and communication that is taking place with the previous setting. Now, of course, you're going to get those outliers where someone is jaded or whatever the case may be, but the more information you have, taking the time to do those record reviews, not just by administration, but by the teachers in your classrooms, their input is beyond valuable. They're going to be able to read between the lines, so to speak, more than anybody else. They already know the dynamics of their classroom. They know what works for them. They can give you feedback on all of that. Finding out, if students have individualized education plans, what's written in those plans? Are they even updated? If you have a 12-year-old and their IEP was written when they were 3, it is not applicable. But these are the things that people don't necessarily take the time to look at. So making sure that the record reviews are complete and complete by all of the staff members who are going to be the most important touch points for this child. Also, I would argue not to rely solely on reports, written reports, letters of recommendation. I would say, especially if you have a high needs child, you're already aware that they potentially are a high needs child, have that conversation with the teachers and the administration who had that child before. Because even when everyone is being super polite and super friendly, you're still going to be able to read between the lines, and especially when mom or dad are coming to you out of fear. They're scared that their child isn't going to be treated well. They're scared that somebody's going to make them feel like their child is not the most important person on the planet, because they are. Those kids are the most important person on the planet, to us and to their parents. They already maybe have been mistreated in some capacity. We're going to get a skewed version of potentially what's going on. So there are processes and systems that can be put in place that really rely more on the records and also on having additional conversations with very specific questions like you're talking about, with the appropriate verbiage. We're not trying to offend anybody, but let's just get a clearer picture of what's actually going on. Keeping in mind that environmental change is a beautiful thing. A child may be struggling with certain things in one setting, and just simply coming to a different situation with different people, with a different environment, being treated in a different way, you may see an entirely different child, but I would argue that many things do carry over. And so we have to look for those commonalities of what hasn't worked, what has worked, and then what can we do, moving forward with a proactive plan, as opposed to, here's your student, you've never even seen their records, mom and dad say everything's perfectly fine, and now we're in week 4, and this student requires as much attention of 6 students. And so trying to avoid all of that is, I think, really important. So like I said, there's a lot of ways to go about that. I think that it's something that can, be formalized, across all settings, but I also think it's something that is a conversation to have with each individual school and each set of administration, because some of the nuances are going to be different depending on the individual schools and what they're seeing in the populations that surround those areas.
Everyone's silent.
I know.
Well, our participants aren't silent, let me tell you what. There's a lot here. And so I just want to throw out a couple of comments that have come in. Sure. And I appreciate what you said about admissions. I think that, what certainly most relevant is that, if we're doing things the way we did them 10 or 20 years ago, it's just not the same world, it's not the same expectations, and it's not necessarily the same students and families that are coming to us. So I appreciate that.
I'd also,
let's see.
Kathy, before you go on, I just want to acknowledge Bryn's outline of specific strategies for our public school friends, because Montessori is in the public school, and although they don't call it admissions, there is a child comes in, and I think the two things that Bryn touched upon that public school personnel at every level also can do is read the running record. read the record, and access the health record. There is no reason why a teacher can't access what the inoculation status is of the child, what the birth status was. Medical records are available for teachers in public school settings, and also they can invite parents to have babysitters or grandparents write their anecdotal story about a child, because their anecdotal story, I think the second important point that you bring to heart, Bryn, is read between the lines. When a grandmother says this child was colicky and fussy from the very beginning, you know, that's a touch point for us and information that allows us to access. So all schools have some level of admission system, and it may look different. So participants, if you come from public schools, you too have a process of bringing children into your school and into your community and into your classrooms.
Thanks for that great reminder, Tanya, because we do work with a lot of schools that are public and or charter schools. So Bryn, you have a couple of questions and comments here. Do you ever get to that 2 weeks of data collection and find that there is no particular time of the day that's more problematic? So you see a more generalized distribution. So it may not have to do with time of day. It could be other things, but yeah. And as a private school, who do we turn to for help? Now this is really common. Who do we turn to for help with the right approach in helping these children if the parents don't know what to do? The state is of no help, and the wait time for a private therapist or specialist is up to 6 months. And that's common in many, many areas. It's either outpriced, people cannot afford it, or the wait time is just way beyond what people can really deal with. And appreciate you're willing to do some of this for schools, you know, by distance, but you're one person.
Right. No, I understand. And of course, you know, like I said, I would love to help on whatever individual basis I can, but having this broader conversation is that reminder of we are here to teach, and we can only do what we can do in the amount of hours that we have. So focusing in on, okay, how can we best help these kids? What are those few goals? And how can we best teach it? Because the teachers are extraordinary, and they have their own ideas, and they have their own bag of tricks, and they have all these tools in their toolbox that very well may be enough if we get specific about what it is we're trying to teach. So when we stay in that generalized mindset, this is where the assumptions and I think the pitfalls come in. When we stay in that generalized mindset of how do we get it to stop? So we're focusing on decreasing. It doesn't teach anything. Or if we get in the mindset of, well, I just want them to communicate better. Okay, not specific enough. What are we specifically trying to teach? And if our teachers start thinking about, okay, I am specifically, you know, for an example here, I'm going to specifically start to help my students learn how to recognize that a problem exists. And we're going to focus on that and only that. And every time I see it, I'm going to point it out. And every time I see a student do it, I'm going to let them know that that was exactly what I was looking for. And I'm going to create situations in my classroom where the kids have to identify it in order to move on to the next thing that they're looking for. And I'm going to start creating this. I'm going to start teaching it specifically. You know, this week I'm going to start thinking about how do I teach my students to make a decision? What does that look like? What does it specifically look like? I myself as a teacher, what are the steps I would like to see take place? And then how do I communicate to that to my kids? It can all become lessons. We can come at it from that standpoint of, okay, we're going to look to teach these missing skills. Because ultimately, if the missing skills emerge and the kids are practicing them, it leaves very little room or time for the problematic behaviors to occur.
Right.
Now, depending on the level of problematic behavior, that's where you have to rely on your administration. Because if you have a kid that requires de-escalation strategies, there's very specific ways to go about that. That does require specialized training. Yes, it does. And it shouldn't be assumed that someone would know how to do that. And the parents should also be made aware that potentially that's a setting that cannot support those types of behaviors. That's a different conversation. But if we're coming at it from a standpoint of, okay, the risk to benefit ratio is where it needs to be, then how do we teach these other skill sets specifically? And then you'll watch the problematic behaviors end up reducing, and then, like I said, there's those outlier and other emergency type situations that need to be handled in a specific way. So I hope
so
that
you
that
just,
helps.
yeah, you very helpful, because you just answered several of the next questions that are on our screen here. And I think, because how do you know when enough is enough? And when you're consistently engaging in de-escalation and not able to attend to other children in your classroom, there's clearly a line in the sand that we have to say that's not working for us. It's also a matter of, some of the questions that have come in, Bryn, have to do with a little bit, it's a touchy subject. None of us like to bring up to parents that there's a problem occurring. And parents don't necessarily like to hear that there's something wrong. And personally, I don't think that we have to say there's something wrong with your child. I think that we can bring up, specific behaviors that we've seen, strategies we've tried, and get, start a conversation rather than dumping on the parent and saying, here's all the things that we have found in the past 2 weeks that are wrong with your child. That's that's a personal attack, right?
Absolutely.
So I think a lot of it has to do with that. But parents say, well, I don't see those things at home. Well, at home, maybe there's 2 other children and not 24 other children, or their parents may not identify the behaviors the same way we do. So can you talk a little bit about, because I think that that's another thing that comes up quite often in our questions, is how do we address our parents in this issue in order to gain support and partnership and not have them feel like we're alienating them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, personally, I would say, first and foremost, validate your families always. And I think that Montessori does a good job of that, across the board. But validate your families. You may know their story. You may not know their story. You may not know where they're coming from. Let them know that you are there for them. And everyone is on the same page. And we are going to do the best that we can possibly do. And we love your child no matter what. And all of those things are not negotiable. Also, in our environment, in this setting, these are some of the things that we're seeing. And let them know that it is specific. You're not making generalizations about their child. You're letting them know what you are seeing in the hours that they are in your care. And always start with the positive. These are the skill sets that we're working on, because even if you use the dimensions of observable growth, these are the goals that they'll be able to reach as we work our way up. This is what we're working on. These are some of the challenges that we're facing, and this is how we're addressing them. I feel that the more data, the better, and the more black and white it is. Maybe anecdotal can be very tough to read. I wouldn't necessarily share that with parents, but I would share 0s, 1s, 2, or 3s with them on a nice little graph that just simply shows them if the line is going up or the line is going down. Let them know how their child is trending, as opposed to, on this day and time, so-and-so poked so-and-so in the eye, and then everyone started screaming and it was mass chaos. Not a good idea. But the more data you have and the more formalized your systems and the more simplified, that's a much easier conversation to have with parents, especially if there's any type of graphing involved, because that's something that could just simply be emailed or sent home. And there's no feelings attached to it. It's just simply, this is what we saw today. And this is where we're headed, and this is what we're looking for. And just be able to give them something that isn't about how anybody felt about it in that particular moment, because they're going to feel badly enough about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are very important points. We have a couple other, we have just a question. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Bryn, how do you feel about videotaping children and using digital video portfolios of children, of themselves, taking pictures of themselves working and taking pictures of their own behavior and things like that?
I love it for the use of self-reflection. I don't love it for any type of communication with home. I think it's a teaching tool that can be used individually with the student. And we just have to make sure that everyone is on board and everyone's signatures are in place, that everybody is cool with it, because I know that there can be a lot of red tape and weirdness with that. It also depends, on the behavior. Potentially, if, you're asking a student to start appropriately engaging with peers, that can be a beautiful thing to show, right? Maybe we wouldn't use it on, say, a self-stimulatory behavior, especially if it's, something that is, hurtful in any capacity. So again, knowing what behaviors to use it with, it can be a great tool though. Again, like I said, everything looks scarier on video. CYA, CYA, CYA. Just be very specific about how it's used, and like I said, and have all the proper permission and all that good stuff. But it can be good for kids, and you have to know your kids too, because some are going to be receptive to that, and some it's going to be horribly embarrassing. So it just depends on the student as well.
Okay. We have a question about the socio-emotional, social-emotional checklist or rating scale that you referred to. Is there something available to us as schools that you would recommend? I know some of those things are only available to psychologists or ABA specialists.
Right. Well, one of the checklists that I use was developed by a man named Lewis Weber, and he was my mentor, so very dear to my heart. But it's something that honestly just him and I use in our daily practice. So it's something that, with his permission, of course, I could definitely just share an email to whoever would like to have it. It's literally a list of, an inventory, like I said, of the social and emotional skills. And we use it with our teachers and with our behavior specialists to rate each student in terms of a 0 to 3 rating in each area. And then what we do, because talking again to maybe the public systems or the charter systems that have a little more access to teams with outside disciplines, so guidance counselors and maybe other types of counseling, this and that, then what we do is we divide and conquer. Okay, the teacher's going to focus on these 2 things, the guidance counselor is going to focus on these 2 things, depending on what the individualized education plans, actually call for. So again, it's just another way for teachers to help prioritize, what they're actually looking at with their students, and, give it that number rating so that they know, okay, this is where we need to start and this is where we're going.
So thanks. If you could find out if that's possible, and if I'm sure if you got it to Tim, he could distribute it to our group, because I think that there's a very high interest in getting some objective checklists for us to be able to know, really help teachers know what to look for.
Sure.
I definitely agree, Kathy, but I think that people will find that even when we have that, it really takes some serious training. I mean, we recently went through application of what Bryn's talking about in our own lab school with a group of teachers, and it was quite the exercise. And I suspect what people will find is they may need more. So while we have you, Bryn, reaching out to your mentor to see whether you can share that, I'd like to ask, while people are still online, if you're finding what Bryn has been talking about useful or not. Maybe you're finding it frustrating, or maybe it makes you uncomfortable, maybe you disagree with it. And if you're finding it useful, what is it you sense that you and your team need next? Obviously, Bryn might be willing to come back at some point to do another one of these sessions. I know she's willing to do courses. I've asked you, Bryn, to think about what does it take to really prepare a team of teachers to use this on a permanent basis. And then I know that you're available to coach people. So my question to you folks out there is, at this moment in time, what's your sense of what you need? By the way, if after this is over, you start having thoughts about it, you can reach Bryn through me initially, and I don't remember if we set up a Montessori.org email for you yet.
Not yet.
Okay, so we'll be doing that. So I can pass things along to Bryn temporarily, and we'll get her added to the Montessori Foundation school consulting list. And again, she's available should you need one-on-one help at your school if you got something big going on. But that's just a question of what do you folks feel you need?
We do have a comment from Patrick Olber who says that very useful, reinforces what we've started at Public Charter Montessori with PBIS, which I think is a positive behavior intervention strategies in similar ways as the rest of our school district. Next steps, help create a strategy timeline plan for what to do when we have a child who will recognize and needs more than our expertise. That's from Heather. Eileen Lazinski would like more information on what to do once we've done extensive observations, the ABC data collection. How do we target skill sets and later down the road decide what behaviors to target once the immediate chosen ones have been extinguished? Social emotional skills and the checklist Patrick says would be very useful. Much of what you offered today was for the elementary level, and they'd like some more on the primary 3 to 6 level. Although I've used the same ABC and the data collection at the primary level as well.
I use it for all ages.
I don't find it to be different.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's not significantly different. So there's just a lot of positive and, about what they heard today, and a lot of requests for more. I think a more specific application. So today we had a great overview, and I think a class would be very well received, and some,
Especially
perhaps
with
some
case studies.
Case studies, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe another
I have
webinar.
A lot of friends out there that do these general, how to create a peaceful classroom, how to do general working with kids and to get the, redirect their behavior. There's some really, really good, solid, extensive support for that. What I'm finding, Bryn, is you're contributing in the areas where the normal stuff just hasn't worked well enough.
Right.
And there are all kinds of issues that people have, some of which we've seen several people saying, how do we get them the occupational therapy, the physical therapy, the psychological counseling, the tutoring, the whatever. And some of the answer is, well, it depends on where you are and whether your state cooperates and whether or not the parents know how to advocate to get resources delivered. And the other thing is, many of these things that we talk about actually can be done within a school by volunteers or by engineering the environment. And I don't mean we can do it all. We can't. But a good example would be those giant balls that kids sit on, which for so many kids with sensory issues and ADHD, the very kids we often send out to OT, sitting on one of those giant balls instead of a chair is often one of the strategies that seems to work well, or things that allow the kids to shut out distracting sounds, essentially kind of earmuffs you wear at a shooting range. Just 2 examples. So I think there are things that we can learn to do in-house that will do some of it. You still need resources, but it's nice to know that some of it isn't magic, doesn't require a doctorate or a clinical license unless you're going to go out and practice and call it that. You can just do these things as a teacher in many cases with relatively minor changes of a Montessori environment. So Bryn, would you be willing to come back sometime in the future and carry on?
I would love to. Anytime.
Wonderful. And we'll talk about a course, and we'll talk about what kinds of things you might offer to schools in terms of the way you would normally help a school that wants a one-on-one consultation or training for their staff. And I imagine, Tanya, you and Michael see situations like this with your work in charter and public schools all the time.
That's right. So
we'll explore how to go forward. Welcome to the family, Bryn.
Thank you.
I had suggested you start preparing your first book. I think that the time is needed for something like that. So we want to thank you for being here. We're a minute over. Michael Dorr has reminded me that next week is supposed to be Michael finishing up on curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit more about what you're going to be doing next week, Michael.
Well, I started off with one webinar on curriculum theory. Then last time we went into curriculum content for toddlers, infants, and the primary or CASA level. And time kind of ran out is what happened. And we needed to focus on the elementary to a great extent and the adolescent as well. So that's where we're going. Would be content, curriculum content.
We needed part 2.
Say that again, Kathy.
We need part 3.
I said we need part 3. Right?
Yeah,
Right, we needed part
three
3 on
now.
that one.
Three.
Okay.
Oh, how many?
4. Now we're to 4. Do I hear 5?
Well, by the time we reach that, that's a little class also. But let's
Michael,
think
you
of
are planning to do that class, as I recall. So we need to figure that one out as a class. But we did promise you in the audience we would do the 3rd session. So I will contact my friends in the Virgin Islands who fortunately have power, at least at their school. They have a great story to tell. We'll bump them back a week, and I'll send you out an email letting you all know about Michael next week, and then the other Michael Bourne, and the Virgin Islands Montessori School, which is just one of, I'm sure, more schools than we want to imagine that have been seriously impacted by the storm. But that's not their story. Their story is, how did they prepare? How did they weather? How did they get themselves back up and running? And what lessons are in that for you and for me with the schools that we love, whether we're along the Gulf Coast or the Caribbean or the Atlantic, or whether we're in the high plains or the mountains or wherever. There's no place in the world that doesn't have its challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Bryn, we'll talk, you and I, about you coming back and doing more of what you started today.
Sure.
So this has been really great, everyone. Thank you so much. Bryn, thank you for being with us and meeting the crowd.
Thank you for having me.
We're so pleased. And again, the recording of this will be on the Montessori.org International Montessori Council Members Library in usually 3 or 4 days. I'll have it processed and uploaded, and it'll be there for those of you who are members. So I'd say for this week, we've done a lot. We started a conversation. I'll preserve the questions that were asked because there's some really good stuff that came out of today.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see where we go with all that in the future. Kathy, as always, thank you for your role. Tanya and Michael, thank you for what you do and contribute to this. This has been good work. So for this week, let's call it a day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
See you next week.